Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lessons from Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. I'm Costain, the founder of the Food and Global Security Network. I'm joined today by a superb international panel. Chantal, Wei-Ying, Clément is the Deputy Director of IPES Food based in Brussels. Joona Mikkola is the founder of Soil Watch, and he comes from Finland and lives and works in the Sahel in Sudan. Pritchard is the Chief Executive of the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission based in the UK. And sadly, we were to be joined by Reginaldo Haslid Marroquin, but Reggie has unfortunately been caught out in a storm in rural South Dakota and has no signal, which is a great pity. He'll be greatly missed. I'm going to lead the discussion with our panelists, after which we'll go to you, the audience. So please put any questions that you have into the chat box as we go along, and feel free to introduce yourselves to each other as well. So I want to set the scene. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is brutal and unprovoked, and it's correct that the international community has come to the aid of the Ukrainian people. But the mainstream media narrative of good guys and bad guys, no matter how understandable, is unhelpful and oversimplifies important practical and ethical questions around conflict, political motivations, and the balancing of strategic global power. So we need to take a step back to reflect on the origins of this conflict and a step forward, because this war is almost certainly just a foretaste of the violence and insecurity to come in the next few decades, as ecological breakdown, access to food, and geopolitical instability become welded fundamentally together. President Putin is a megalomaniac, but he's not an idiot. His economy is built on what seemed once to be the hard rock of fossil fuels, but climate change has undermined these foundations, and much needed global policy to reduce carbon emissions will increasingly strand Russia's fossil fuel assets. The Russian economy has therefore become vulnerable to ecological instability, and many more nations will find themselves in similar positions to a lesser or greater extent. So we're now facing a great geopolitical restructuring as national governments attempt to identify new economic strengths and to capture control of alternative assets. After fossil fuels, Russia's next biggest export is cereal. Russia was the world's third biggest producer of wheat in 2020, and if it successfully claims Ukraine, which is the world's sixth biggest producer, it will control up to 30% of the world's supply of this staple ingredient. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that Putin invaded Ukraine simply because of climate policy or the desire for grain. What I am saying is that these are critical underlying elements that factor into Putin's strategic thinking, and which will inevitably factor into the thinking of other leaders in the future. Food ingredients, as a result of a distorted global food commodity system, have tremendous economic value and are becoming critical strategic assets. Ownership of these commodities and control over their routes to market, particularly transportation pinch points, can be weaponized. And while access to nutrition helps to maintain social stability, hunger, poverty, and resentment can quickly lead people into conflict. Ecology, food, and political stability have become intrinsically linked. So what does the current conflict tell us about the state of the global food system today? And if, as we believe, agroecology and regenerative agriculture are the long-term solutions, then what does the rhetoric from governments and farmers urging a return to the most intensive forms of farming as a response to the Ukrainian conflict tell us about the political progress that we're actually making? Let me come first to you, Joona Mikkola from Soil Watch. The people living in the Sahel are some of the poorest in the world, and food insecurity is already high. What's been driving this food insecurity over the last few decades, and how has Russia's invasion of Ukraine made things worse?
Yeah, thanks, Ffinlo, and thanks for the introduction and also for the opportunity of being here. Yeah, it's actually quite an interesting and scary situation here, because, as you said, we've been facing a kind of worsening food security situation here. COVID made it worse. It kind of impacted the commodity supply chains, and now we have the Ukraine war as well. What has been going on in the last couple of decades would can maybe be called as a vicious circle of land degradation. We have unsustainable agricultural practices, an overgrazing, and really quickly growing both human and livestock population, and that has led to basically decrease in soil organic matter in the farmlands. Traditionally, people used to practice what is called shifting agriculture, where they farm an area for a couple of years, and then they move ahead and again abandon it, and then they cut down forest and the native vegetation. So what's been driving the food insecurity is actually land degradation drives it in two ways. We have decreasing yields here, unlike most part of the world where the yields have been increasing in the past couple of decades. Also less feed available for livestock. But then that actually causes something similar to resource conflict. So we have a more and more pressure, bigger population over less and less natural resources, and that is driving conflict across the area, across all Sahel. It's 7,000 kilometers from Senegal to Djibouti. And then as there's more and more conflict, then there's more and more displaced people. And then when people are displaced, they cannot produce food anymore. So conflict is also another driver of food insecurity. And the way,
correct me if I'm wrong, Joona, but the food insecurity in the Sahel has increased, hasn't it, over the last 2 or 3 decades, partly because of the entry into the global market, not only subsistence farming taking place as it has done for decades and centuries before, but because people there have been entering into the global market and selling into the global market.
Yeah, so partly, for instance, in Sudan, in the 70s, the livestock population was about 40 million heads, and now it's 140 million. Most of that goes as export to the Gulf state. And before, a lot of people, they were producing food, keeping livestock also. It was it's a kind of a storage of wealth, and then for their own consumption. And when they were kind of connected with the market economy, they started to increase the herd size as well. So it's definitely there has part to play. And then as well, also access to cheap commodities from abroad, from the global market, has also then led to really quick increase in population as well. And now what we're seeing now with the Ukrainian war, suddenly the cheap commodities are not there anymore. What happened last time when the wheat price went up, it caused the Arab Spring in these areas. So now in a very dire situation here at the moment.
What sort of impacts on the ground have resulted from the Ukraine conflict? I mean, you mentioned there that you don't have the stocks of grain, but what else has actually been happening on the ground?
So why it impacts so much Horn of Africa and North Africa is because, and maybe the Middle East, these countries, they import a lot of wheat from Ukraine and from Russia. And then also we have a very large parts of the population, they live with a very couple of dollars per day. So when it doesn't really hurt us that much in the West, when let's say bread prices double, it does really hurt those people who most of their income really goes just buying, for instance, wheat, and that last time that happened, it increased it led to the Arab Spring, a lot of popular unrest. And yeah, we are quite scared to see what will happen in the coming months in this area.
Now, Joona, just thinking about the food insecurity and the way that it's risen over the last few decades, and now with this layering on top of this conflict in Ukraine, you've said to me in the past that when you run out of old tricks, the things that we usually do, then you need new tricks. I just wonder, what do you think those new tricks are, and how are donors and international agencies changing their approach to dealing with hunger in the Sahel?
Yeah, so yeah, we've been actually having couple of meetings lately with the different UN agencies and donors, and trying to kind of brainstorm that what we can do now when we don't have access to these cheap commodities. And obviously then the most obvious answer is that how can we increase the food production in these countries, and if you ask me, that should have been the focus from at the first point. for a long time, there was kind of an idea of some kind of a comparative advantage, and that certain countries would be producing wheat and other countries would be importing it. But as we see now, there's maybe more and more focus on supply chain resilience, especially when it comes to food. So that's a really good thing. And I would say that also I work mainly with the land degradation and drivers of land degradation. When you invest in sustainable food systems in these countries, you're not only investing in food security, but it's also a climate act. When we produce more per hectare, that means that we have to, there's a lessened conversion of natural habitat into cropland. So that's a very positive direction that should have happened earlier. But I think now the pressure is really piling up that the countries, together with the donors, with the UN agencies, and even the private sector, we're looking at that. How can we invest in sustainable food production in these countries?
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Joona. Let me turn to you, Chantal, Wei-Ying, Clément from IPES Food. If this war is the beginning of a geopolitical restructuring linked to ecological insecurity, with food becoming not only a strategic commodity, but also a weaponized asset, how do food systems and food system governance need to respond and change?
Sure, thanks for this. Honestly, my first thought when I heard your question was, is this war the beginning of major global restructuring? Aren't we just actually continuing patterns of geopolitics that have existed for centuries, but with slightly different players? I think food has been used, you said this rightly in the introduction, it's been used as a strategic asset in many contexts before this one, going back to the sieges centuries ago to today. And I think I was looking this up, I think it was in 1974 that the USDA secretary coined the phrase, food is a weapon, when US was shaping its foreign aid policy. So again, these ideas far predate where we are today, but fast forward to 50 years later, and we're actually in a very similar situation, just playing out against the backdrop of climate change, half a century of globalization. So really everything is just so much more amplified. But in terms of how do food systems need to respond and change, I think a first step really is a lot of the things that Joona already said. It's really just to acknowledge that food systems have been failing us far before this crisis started. And these failures are wrapped up in these broader structural issues related to governance and power. Certainly the invasion of Ukraine is what has sparked another food crisis or food price crisis. And I'd specify that this is the third food price crisis in only 15 years. But we know our food systems are part of a much bigger, much longer story about lack of access, lack of distribution, poverty, debt. I think the numbers from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization report on food insecurity was just released this week, and it confirms all of this. The state of hunger and malnutrition in the world today, because of COVID, conflict, etc., are basically the same as they were in 2015. So 2015, 2016, when we created the UN Sustainable Development Goals to overcome these challenges. That's extremely troubling to think that in that amount of time, we've essentially achieved very little. Our food systems really just shouldn't be this vulnerable to disruption. So I think, if the Ukraine conflict ended tomorrow, we'd still be facing some kind of global food crisis because of something else, our reliance on chemical inputs, because of the impacts of our agricultural practices on natural resources, on the soil, as was already said, because of ongoing health pandemics, there's always something around the corner. And really, because of the very structures, if I can use the C word, of capitalism, to be honest, which is enriching some actors like big grain traders, commodity speculators, input companies. And these are being furthered by our national governments, their agricultural, trade, and aid policies for decades, to the detriment of our world's most vulnerable populations, farmers included. So again, first step, I think let's just acknowledge that and take a really hard look at the systems and the structures that are in place that got us here in the first place. I could go on, but I think that's plenty to start out with.
I mean, you've mentioned there the reliance on chemical inputs and the role of capitalism and speculation. I just wonder if there are other sort of structural issues that you're aware of at IPES.
Yeah, I think Joona talked about an important one, which is just dependence. Dependence on imports and this logic that has structured globalization around this kind of logic of export orientation, comparative advantage, those kinds of things. So we can talk about speculation, we can talk about debt, perhaps at a later stage, But it's the global structures of how we shape trade agreements, how we structure trade, how we structure humanitarian aid relief as well as kind of part of all of this. All that being said, there are some very practical and positive solutions happening on the ground, but these can only be scaled up and really be meaningful, if we look at this whole system that's really tamping down on these positive efforts.
Well, let's focus for a moment on that scaling, if you like, because each of us on this call is involved in some way in the political effort to make agroecology mainstream. And so I guess the simple question is, when you're within this bubble that we live in, it feels like we're making progress, but actually when you start to see that progress sort of dribbling away perhaps as a result of the Ukraine conflict, the question is, are we winning? And how is the war in Ukraine affecting the political argument for change at a European Union level?
Sure. I think it's good to maybe remain a bit positive because there's so much bad news going on at the moment. But as we know, agroecology, it's not just a set of agricultural practices. It's a whole framing. It's a paradigm. It's really just a shift in mindset of how we do food systems differently. And this can be a really hard thing to pitch to those in power who've been maintaining the status quo for decades. But at the same time, this is really a moment of opportunity, right? This crisis, or these repeated crises, have brought all this to light. So I like to think that on a global scale, we are slowly but surely gaining ground. I think before I get to the EU, you might have heard of the Agroecology Coalition, which was created last year in the aftermath of the UN Food System Summit. That's a whole other topic. But this coalition now brings together, I think, 30-some governments and other actors willing to mainstream agroecology. And unsurprisingly, many of these countries are countries from the global south, those who've been forced into a global system that doesn't work to their advantage. I think in West Africa, we're seeing Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, really increasing their focus on agroecological production. As a result of the crisis, we also just saw Ghana announce a progressive shift towards organic fertilizers to curb rising input costs. If we look beyond grain, which is really the main topic of this crisis, we're seeing countries as well, many vulnerable countries who are actually self-sufficient in local staple crops, like millet, like sorghum, things that are climate resilient, locally adapted, locally consumed, all of this kind of fitting under the umbrella of agroecology. And we can go elsewhere as well, but all around the world, we're seeing these kind of pockets of opportunity and hope. In the EU, though, I think you're right that we really saw, especially I think in March at the start of this crisis, these two very opposing visions for food systems really being amplified by the crisis. Specifically, I saw, unsurprisingly, it kind of came from the agricultural side, or the kind of agricultural policy side, that we saw these real efforts from the agricultural commissioner to hold off implementation of some of the EU's most sustainable food policies under the farm to fork strategy. So things like questioning pesticide directives, questioning nature restoration laws, and that was really worrying. But luckily, I think the Commission Vice President, so Hans Timmermans, has really held his ground, I think, to preserve the EU's sustainability ambitions, because he and his team are really thinking about long-term resilience over short-term productivity. And I think that's not something to be taken lightly. I think agroecology was explicitly mentioned as a means to create long-term resilience to crises in a communications from the Commission on safeguarding food security a few months ago. And I think now we're seeing some of this language being backed up by the proposal just put out by the Commission last week as part of the kind of more specifics of the biodiversity and farm to fork strategies, so including legally binding targets, which is really how we get anywhere. So that kind of thing is really exciting. But of course, this is just a proposal. It has to go to the Parliament, has to go to the Council. So at this point, it's really up to member states, up to the Parliament to stand up and support these ambitions and not just torpedo the whole process and let things get watered down as it goes through the political process.
I agree with you that it's been really interesting to see and really positive to see the response of the Commission in the face of this attempt to slow progress around farm to fork, that they really have kind of held to the line that they need to make progress and think for the longer term. But I just thinking about that sort of coalition of agricultural interests that was pushing the Commission to hold off on the farm to fork. I'm wondering whether you see the Ukraine conflict, whether they were simply being opportunistic stick and decided that this was a really good way of managing some PR and trying to advocate for the old status quo from the Commission, or whether they were coming from a position of genuine fear about the changes that were going to come through the Farm to Fork strategy, whether they were genuinely nervous that Farm to Fork wouldn't be able to deliver food for people in Europe.
Sure. I think firstly, to be honest, we're all using this as a kind of PR opportunity to push for, you know, the values that we believe in. But I think there was genuinely always some fear, I think, around the direction of the Farm to Fork strategy from some constituents, specifically around productivity, specifically around yields, but really just because nobody likes to shake up the status quo. And I think it's been interesting to hear the Commission's language around some of this, because they are supporting agroecology, but this is coming out alongside a lot of business as usual language as well. So a lot of talk about increasing productivity, you know, sort of new breeds, research into, you know, new technological strategies for climate resilience. So a lot of this is being said, but in a pretty contradictory way, because, you know, again, politically, I think you're trying to appeal to all audiences. But I think, you know, from a lobbying perspective, perhaps, I think there was some real fear that we are changing the models on which we're basing our systems at the moment. You know, we're pointing to many things beyond this conflict. We can talk about livestock, we can talk about monocultures, et cetera. These things are all being threatened by the Commission's current direction. So, you know, of course, there is genuine fear that these things will be phased out as we move forward.
Sue Pritchard from the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission in the UK. You're based here in Great Britain. What impact has the war had on the political appetite for agroecology in Britain, do you think? And perhaps more importantly, how do you think the war is affecting actual food production on the ground?
Thanks, everyone. Just really loving listening to Chantal and Joona, just really cutting to the chase about what the big structural issues are. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that shortly. Without a doubt, the war in Ukraine and the conditions that Chantal's already listed before that has encouraged the kind of productivist mindset in the UK. Those farmers and growers who have, you know, often for very, very good reasons, in their absolute heart and soul, this desire to feed the world. The point of them being farmers is to feed the world, and to feed the world as efficiently and as effectively as possible. In the last decade or so, as the shift to more agroecological or regenerative paradigms has started to really grow, those farmers who are, you know, deeply rooted in the productivist paradigm have perhaps struggled. Now, that all being said, many farmers have already made the kinds of changes that shift towards more regenerative farming practices, and therefore have alleviated some of the shocks that others have faced, the rising price of fertilizers and inputs, for example, energy costs, fuel costs. And so for those who have already made the transition, they are feeling very grateful, let's say, that they've already made those shifts. For farmers who have been waiting for clearer signals, clearer policy signals from our own government about the real direction of travel of farm policy in the UK, they have, I think, started to take much stronger signals from the market. And so for particular commodities, as both Chantal and Joona have already said, those commodity prices are going sky high, and farmers who can are really trying to maximize their production from their land holdings. So in my area where I live in Wales, I farm in Wales, where I live in Wales, when I go for a walk around the lanes now, I can see that some of my neighbours are ploughing right up to the hedges and right down to the stream corridors, whereas just last year they'd have left 2 metre boundaries and riparian corridors to protect habitats and to support wildlife corridors. So that those environmental gains are already lost.
And why is that happening, Sue? Is it a response to Ukraine and the idea that they are suddenly somehow responsible for, all of the food that everybody eats around the world? Or is it a response to transitions in environmental legislation in the UK arising perhaps from Brexit and the reorganisation of the way that British farmers relate to the replacement for the common agricultural policy?
I think we're at a point in time where some of the taken for granted assumptions of what kind of food system we need in the planet have been really challenged, and we are bringing to fruition a new set of practices, but also principles and values about how food systems should be in the future. They should not harm the planet. They should be more equitable, more inclusive, more fair. The principles that are embodied really well in agroecology. But I think, again, Chantal named it very clearly. Even though we can point to all of the detrimental effects that the old food system has had on land and on health, on water quality, on air quality around the world, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that there are still some very powerful beneficiaries of the current system. And as we work and collaborate across agencies, across organisations, across nations to try and bring a new paradigm into being, I think it would be naive of us not to recognise that the old world does not die quietly. And a phrase I've been using quite a lot recently is that for all the work that we talk about midwifing the new into being, using either public policy or other tools and instruments, we also have to think really quite hard about hospicing the old and helping the old world die more effectively. The old values, the old ideas, the old ways of doing business, they have to be helped to come to an end really much more quickly. And that's at the heart of conversations around what a just transition looks like. I mean, just one slightly shocking stat that I was reminded of when I was preparing for the conversation today. The sorts of things that we're talking about here and now were being talked about in a very animated way at Davos just a few weeks ago, and David Beasley, the United Nations World Food Programme lead, was pointing out the incredible urgency and seriousness of the war in Ukraine on food security, on hunger, on starvation in particular parts of the world. But alongside that particular burning platform, he reminded us that the net worth of the richest, many of whom were at Davos, increased by £5.2 billion per day in the last year. £5.2 billion a day. Now, one of the things that I think we probably do need to come on to fairly quickly in this conversation is the willingness of governments and of international governance arrangements to require that the wealthy pay much more of their fair share to rebalance inequalities around the world. And that's not a kind of that shouldn't be a kind of polite request anymore. It should become an absolute requirement of a civilized planet, that the richest don't have a voluntary option to pay appropriate taxes and appropriate contributions proportionate to their wealth. They must be required to do so, because anything else is just outrageously unfair.
Sue, I completely take that point. And Chantal, I want to come back to you in just a moment. But before I do, you were talking about the market and the way that the indications from the market can help to change things. And I'm just wondering, whether, and perhaps this is what you were indicating, that the way in which the war has pushed up the prices of fertilizer and other things, if there are people who have been interested in agroecology, but they haven't quite taken the plunge, do you think that this has helped to create a market-driven response that's positive in terms of delivering not only delivering some environmental benefit, as well as this challenge that you were talking about farmers ploughing right up to the fence, etc.?
I think for some people it has, but I mean the reality is that a transition to regenerative practices doesn't happen overnight. So if you just take out fertilizers from farms, you will have a drop in yields. Now, you can absolutely mitigate that in a managed transition to more regenerative practices using organic manures and different tilling practices. But the reality is, if you're going to make a rapid change from one year to the next, you're going to take a hit on yields. And so lots of farmers have been making real kind of accountancy-led decisions about the price they're anticipating getting for their arable crops next year, and the cost of the massively increased cost of those inputs. So different farmers in different places with different opportunities, different bank balances, frankly, different appetites for risk, are making different kinds of decisions, because the market signals are very erratic at the moment. And certainly in the UK, our government has not yet given the clearest form of leadership that it could in the transition from one set of farm support payments to a new set of farm support payments, and also being prepared to tackle the additional issues of food insecurity, food poverty, health, nutrition, well-being.
Chantal, I want to come on to that issue of potentially taxing, wherever that money comes from, whether it's from the richest or wherever, and spending and where that spending goes. And as we know, healthy living soil and a vibrant ecology are vital for a nation's resilience and its strategic strength. And in response to the war, we've heard an awful lot about increased military spending or increasing military spending. But is it the case that genuine national defense and security should also require more investment in agroecological food production and food system reform?
I mean, sure, absolutely, of course. As we said earlier, food security is national security to a large extent. And if we want agroecology to have any chance to thrive within the current context or future context, we have to create the incentives to allow farmers to adopt agroecology. As we said, diversify their production, protect lands, etc. Reduce dependence on external inputs. But yes, this is going to require major investment, major support. And the interesting thing is, while financing is usually the tricky part of the conversation, we actually already have, we have that covered. I think the FAO report that I like to cite that was released last year stated that 90% of the, I think, $540 billion spent on global agricultural subsidies per year are harmful. They're harmful to people, they're harmful to the planet. That's 90%. So, redirecting even a fraction of that in the right direction could have a huge impact. Subsidies and public policies can't keep locking us into these systems that, as I said, are failing us. And many, including the EU that I mentioned earlier, are starting to talk about this strategically in the context of food security. And I think what's been interesting on this kind of finance part is that there's also been a big push within climate debates to increase climate finance for agroecology, climate finance for regenerative solutions. So, looking ahead to climate negotiations later this year, beyond kind of the food crisis, I'm really hoping and suspecting that there's going to be a lot more talk about climate finance for food systems change, and specifically agroecology in those spaces. So, perhaps another avenue of possibility to support what we're doing. But beyond that, I think we've already seen more support. I mentioned the EU, but we just saw, I think last month, the USDA announced an additional $300 million to support farmers to transition to organic. This is a really small amount compared to the billions they're investing in other types of agriculture, but it's a step in the right direction. So I think we just have to take these as wins and keep building from there.
And within that farm to fork strategy, there is, and the discussion around agroecology rather than simply, regenerative farm management, there is that conversation where there is at least an ambition now to start trying to reconnect climate outcomes with biodiversity outcomes, with social outcomes, and a sort of a redistribution of money so that we're valuing smaller farmers as well as larger farmers. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're saying is exactly on the mark, that, we have to not just talk about better agricultural practices. We already said it's also about how we distribute food, improve income, develop the right social safety nets so everyone can afford and access healthy foods. I think at the international level, that, again, I'm stressing this again, that means talking about debt relief or even debt cancellation, because these vulnerable countries, they need the funds to invest in the infrastructures and programs that are needed. At the national level, we can talk about ambitious anti-hunger programs. We've seen them in Brazil in the past, supporting local and regional markets, which has already been mentioned. So really, we are talking about a system-wide revamp that needs financing, not just production methods.
I noticed that we're running on in terms of time, so I'm going to move on to the next issue. And Sue, just thinking about the Arab Spring, where an increase in the price of bread led just about coping communities into protests and ultimately into revolution. And thinking about what's happening in the Sahel now, as Joona explained earlier, what should Western governments be doing right now to alleviate pressure on global markets and on the world's poorest people?
So it's very, very clear to me that Western governments need to take their responsibilities really seriously in investing in sustainable and agroecological practices in those most vulnerable countries. I think we're all very alert and anxious about some global initiatives which turn their attention to the global south, but do so in an extractive and instrumental way. How certain corporates or certain institutions can incorporate countries in the global south into a globalized food market by enticing them into that kind of monoculture and commodity-led set of systems. But I think in Western countries and in the global north, we absolutely have to be investing in the sorts of heterogeneous farming practices and locally contextually relevant farming practices that enable countries to have a better chance of feeding themselves. That's a critical role for development aid. At the moment, we're cutting our aid budget in the UK, which is horrifying and shocking at a time when we need to be investing much more in the alleviating policies that support countries who are experiencing not just the Ukraine impacts, but climate impacts. Again, Chantal and Joona listed those right at the start. We are continuing on a trajectory where crisis after crisis after crisis is the future that was foretold 20, 30 years ago. This level of disruption and turbulence as a result of the decisions that we didn't make then and are still failing to make now was what we expected. So it's incumbent, I think, upon governments in the global north to be investing as an absolute responsibility, kind of almost a kind of anti-colonial responsibility, a reparations project to ensure that countries in the global south can meet their minimum needs. And that actually does mean us in the global north having some really hard conversations with ourselves about how much planetary resources we're quite prepared to suck up and waste for things that really are not that important to the quality of our lives. So there's a big conversation, I think, for us in the global north to have about how we think about demand and consumption, and how far we're prepared to start introducing policies that moderate demand, and that engage citizens in those really kind of straight conversations, that it's, for us in the global north, it is our demand on the planetary resources that is causing, it's a direct cause of the crises that we are talking about here.
Now, you've talked about investment a lot there, and you started talking there about market forces, and governments are always very reluctant to intervene in the market. I mean, at least they say they are, even if interventions do happen. And so I wonder, Sue, as we move into this new era where fossil fuel economies are becoming stranded, where there is this new scramble, and taking Chantal's point that yes, food has been at the center of conflict, resource conflict, since the dawn of time, but it seems to me that there is a resurgence around food as a result of the ecological breakdown that we're seeing around us. What I'm wondering is how we can, either as individuals or or as think tanks and NGOs, within this conversation, what can we be doing to increase a sense of food sovereignty, the importance of food sovereignty, to help to decrease corporate and governmental power, so that universal access to good quality nutrition becomes a foundation of peace and stability, rather than something, which it is at the moment, that can be controlled and weaponized?
And there's so much in that question there, and I'm just going to kind of quickly start out with a quick comment that the idea that we are a kind of predatory and aggressive species isn't entirely borne out by a more thoughtful reflection on our history. That for tens and tens and tens of thousands of years, humans were able to collaborate, were able to work effectively together. We're able to recognize that all of our interests and our concerns are deeply, deeply interconnected and interdependent. So the story that we've now told ourselves, that we are, we're aggressive and we're predatory, and it's a dog eat dog world, and that's inevitable. It's an inevitable part of the human condition. I think really does need to be challenged. It does need to be confronted. That kind of argument serves particular purposes, and so in a kind of odd way, I think one of the things that we can be doing really effectively right now is changing the stories that we tell ourselves about what is important to us as a species, and how we can find ways of working together much more collaboratively and much more thoughtfully for everybody's interests. So instead of us kind of going along with this notion that unless we have strong mediating mechanisms, we'll just always be trying to grab what we can for ourselves. We just ask ourselves some different questions. We tell ourselves some different stories about what's possible. So I think in very practical terms, I think that means working much more directly with citizens and citizens in communities. And certainly, just very quickly, the work we've done at FFCC with 150 of the poorest communities in the UK with big local and local trust demonstrates that absolutely clearly to me, that with the right conversations, the right information, with the right data, people who are often experiencing great food insecurity themselves are horrified and furious that their poverty is being weaponized to shore up a particular version of the food system, and want to see governments and business working together much more effectively to create a much fairer, much more sustainable, and much more balanced food system that meets everybody's needs and looks after our planet.
Thanks, Sue. That's great. And also just to mention to people that in terms of an introduction to the Big Local project, there is a Farmgate podcast. I'll give you the link for that, in due course, that we did with the Food Farming and Countryside Commission, outlining the Big Local project and its importance. It's a really good project. Joona, just finally coming back to you before we go to our audience. There have been many food crises over our lifetimes, and we've talked about 3 in the course of the last 15 years. This is just the latest. But from what you've seen and from the conversations that you've had, from the conversations you've been involved in with the World Food Programme and other agencies, Do you feel hopeful that something will change for the better as a result of this food crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would maybe mention that that's a result of two crises. It's the food crisis and the climate crisis. And it is evidently it's just two sides of this of the same crisis, which is that we're living beyond the boundaries of this planet. There's a British ecological economist. He has said that poverty will be only made history if nature enters economic calculations the same way we calculate buildings and infrastructure. So I think that's what's happening in the aid and development community. Instead of, we used to have these isolated interventions of water and mitigating conflict and improving food security and not really having an integrated strategy on what's going on the ground. Why are we seeing more and more conflict and worsening food security situation? And I feel because of this, that people are coming to realize that a lot of the humanitarian disasters that are happening are caused by environmental degradation. Then it's quite clear that if we really want to change something over long term, we need to take nature into account. So, for instance, what we're doing with the WFP, WFP traditionally used to distribute food, namely, those purchased from other countries and then distributed to these poor countries. What we're now looking at with the WFP is that how can we improve the food security and build stability in the community level by restoring landscapes. So we kind of going back into the sustainable governance of natural resources and then restoring ecosystems. And there we would be actually addressing way more problems than just food security. Actually, land use, it constitutes 30% of the world's carbon footprint. When what we estimate that the cost of the renewable energy will go down, so the land use probably be even bigger share of the carbon footprint, and it should not be. This is one of the few sectors which actually could be a carbon sink. So all that is kind of coming together. What we are seeing in our work is that we do believe that over time there will be price for carbon. This price will affect that curve, as you mentioned, that will curve a demand on very high carbon products. However, that will also create a massive financial vehicle for landscape restoration in these countries where we work. It is already there. It's just pulling these things together. We believe that over time, climate finance will really be a very important vehicle for financing sustainable development in these countries.
And it's trying to make sure, of course, that that carbon financing in and of itself doesn't create distortions around other forms of natural capital and degradation of biodiversity in one way or another. And I think that the work that you're doing, in particular, Joona, with the way that you're channeling that finance in order that you can do broader natural capital restoration, the delivery of agroecology and regenerative farm management in the Sahel is extremely interesting. And thank you for that. Look, thanks so much to all three of you for those fantastic contributions. I think we should go to our audience. We only have another sort of 12 or 13 minutes before we need to draw to a close. I've got a question here from Nikki, which is, and I'm not sure whether to send this to Chantal or Sue, so perhaps you can kind of wave a hand when you decide. How do we address the market dependency for outputs as opposed to just inputs? For example, synthetic fertilizers. Many farmers identify the development of markets for their agroecologically produced products as being too slow to meet their demands to shift farm businesses into shorter supply chains. So how do we address the market dependency for outputs? Who wants to have a go? Sue.
So I think there are auspicious lines emerging in the government's, albeit very weak, response to the National Food Strategy. It talks about strengthening public procurement and local supply chains. And so working with local governments and anchor institutions at a local scale over a period, I think can be really fruitful. So one of the conversations that we had in Wales as part of our own public procurement research policy was encouraging those anchor institutions to enter into conversations with collaboratives of farmers or collectives, co-ops of farmers, and to shift contracts over, we said at the time, a 7-year period, so that first of all farmers and cooperatives can gear up collectively to provide the quantity of outputs that are needed, but also that the buyers can first of all divest themselves of their existing contracts with their standard suppliers, but also be more reassured that the new arrangements would stand up to the particular demands of a big public procurement initiative. So I think that there are glimmers. There are glimmers of possibility starting to show up in places around the UK.
Thanks very much, Sue. Joona, probably this is one for you, which is, how do you see the role of precision breeding in countering ongoing issues in global food supply chains? And I guess, as well as precision breeding, perhaps you should think about that more broadly in terms of the role of technology.
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't been working that much on precision breeding. Yeah, I mean, we definitely see here there's a couple of UN agencies which are developing a more drought and higher temperature resistant varieties, which are certainly needed. So, but yeah, to be honest, I haven't been working very much on that myself.
Do you have any thoughts, either Chantal or Sue?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question, maybe, that I'm going to dance around, but when we look at precision breeding, it may offer some benefits, I think, in terms of short-term resilience, perhaps less input and energy use, maintaining yields, things like that. But, you know, again, from our perspective, we have to look at the context in which these technologies are being developed. You know, does precision breeding mean it's going to be the same handful of companies guiding the direction of our food systems? You know, does this kind of innovation mean it's going to keep taking public funds away from diversification, from protecting biodiversity? You know, does it mean maintaining monoculture crop systems, huge industrial livestock systems, which, you know, again, ultimately aren't so natural and aren't able to provide sustainable livelihoods for farmers? Maybe one thing is that with some colleagues, we recently looked at the uptake of any innovation to be considered against the 13 principles of agroecology that were outlined by the FAO. You know, just to maybe use that as a benchmark to look at, when we're thinking about adopting a technology, is it really delivering on all the co-benefits that agroecology proposes, you know, beyond productivity? Is it working on environmental grounds, socioeconomic grounds, cultural grounds? And I think when we look at it from this broader framing, it really helps us assess, you know, whether a technology is helpful or not for the long term.
This next question is quite UK centric, but I think we could sort of take it in terms of the UK, but also in terms of the European Union and the way that farm to fork strategy might work. And the question is, by what mechanisms, and most importantly, in terms of the question for me, on what timescale could the desired level of taxation that Sue talks about be delivered? What's the ideal transition time, I guess, from where we are now to where we need to be if those finances were to be shifted?
Well, 2030 is a critical point in time, isn't it? But that's not, you know, waiting until 2030 to try and get everything done in the last year or 18 months or so. It is starting to put mechanisms in place right now so that by 2030 we've created more promising conditions to be able to tackle these huge issues that we're describing here. I mean, I don't really want to give a glib answer. It's too easy to do that. Well, we haven't got much time. But what is clearly needed is much more energy invested in shareholder action and ensuring that shareholders are able to consider a whole raft of considerations, not just shareholder value. And the supranational actions, where the European Union had been doing some really good work on this to make sources of funds and locations of funds much more transparent, much less opaque, is another step in that direction. And I think perhaps the third thing relates again to to working directly with citizens, doing everything we can to work directly with citizens so that we reveal for citizens much more of what is fundamentally a very opaque food system, where the kind of risks are taken by citizens and primary producers very often, but all of the rewards are being sucked up by this sort of invisible middles and global multinationals, but and often speculators, people who are speculating on the financialization of food. So bringing much more transparency to citizens in the global north about what's really going on, and inviting them to not just change their purchasing habits in a supermarket, but change how they vote for governments who are prepared to tackle those big structural issues.
This is probably the final question that we'll deal with today, and I think it might be one that it's worth each of you having a bit of a go at, and just sort of summarising any points that you have for the end. And the question is, can panelists comment on how looking at the climate, ecosystem, food breakdown issue through the lens of water and the hydrological cycle, as opposed to carbon only, would change our emphases on these solutions? I'm gonna be. Oh, go on, Joona. You're ready to go. Fantastic.
I can comment from this. So what I'm doing and what I'm researching is the sustainable management of semi-arid and arid lands. So obviously, water is a big limiting factor there. I think how it changes the climate action is that it's actually the start with that we realize that there's a water crisis. That it's actually the extra addition of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's just the tip of an iceberg. We have a way bigger problem down there. It's a collapse of biodiversity. We are losing here in Sahel, for instance. We have a massive areas of land. We're completely wiping off biomass on top of that land. We're wiping off the rooting system. We're wiping off the soil organic carbon. So that means when it rains, the water doesn't stay in that landscape. So they're completely combined, the climate crisis and the water crisis. And then again, for instance, I work with climate action. There are a lot of people getting like an engineer approach on climate crisis, saying, let's just build a machine which will suck down carbon from the atmosphere. And then there's more, let's say, more system thinking people saying, no, that's probably not going to solve the problem what we have, that the extra carbon in the atmosphere, it's just an indication that we are tipping off the planet of its balance of the biogeographical cycle. So I think that taking water into account, it will maybe channel more attention towards landscape and nature. And I think that's the right way to go.
Thanks, Joona. Chantal. And we're coming very much to the end now, so we can just keep contributions brief. That was a really good overview. Thanks, Joona.
Yeah, I think Joona said it all. We're mostly systems people here in this virtual room, not silver bullet solutions people. So I don't think a single metric is ever the solution, whether it's carbon, methane, perhaps water. And again, coming from a policy perspective, I think there's no reason we should be having these conversations separately. You know, we have different UN institutions or UN forums dealing with biodiversity, with climate, with desertification, with soils. These are all part of the same problem, right? So we know these things are interlinked, and making that effort, you know, from the local to the global level to connect these issues is how we get to somewhere more sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a point that Christiana Figueres, who was, you know, championing the Paris Agreement, made in one of the podcasts that we did again with the Food Farming and Countryside Commission, wasn't it, Sue? That, you know, one of the biggest mistakes the UN had made was separating out these processes, these environmental processes 30 years ago, when actually, you know, the effort now needs to be to reintegrate them. Sue, any final thoughts from you?
Just absolutely agreeing with everything everybody's saying, including in the chat, and perhaps just strengthening my current obsession, which is finding ways of engaging citizens in some of these big and complex issues, because I know that they are interested. People do care about these things, and finding the ways to talk about these complex interconnected issues, and through my experience, through the lens of food, because we all eat food, it can be very powerful, very engaging, very involving, and and can motivate citizens to work then not just on food and food issues, but also on all of the other interconnected resilience building issues that we know we're going to need a lot more of in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm seeing in the chat, obviously there was that whole sort of conversation we're having around water, and somebody just mentioned Walter Joona, and we will be holding another webinar later in the year with Walter and focusing on the water issue. So please, keep an eye out for that. Look, thank you. That's all we got time for. I think that's been a fascinating hour. If you haven't yet had the chance to read the Food and Global Security Network's report, Soil Health, a Security Threat Profile, may I urge you to do so. There are chapters in there from one or two people in the audience, as well as from at least two of the panel members that we have today. There's some really interesting stuff. You can find it and the webinar from its launch on our website, foodandsecurity.net. And if you've enjoyed this discussion, then why not have a listen to the Farmgate podcast if you haven't already. In each program, I speak to experts about different aspects of agroecology and the transition to regenerative food production. So Farmgate can be found wherever you listen to podcasts. I'd like to thank our superb panelists, Sue Pritchard, Joona, Mikkola, and Chantal, Wei-Ying, Clément. I'm sorry that we can't hear an applause, but I'd ask you to give them a hand. And of course, thank you to you too, wherever you are in the world, for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. I've been ffinlo Costain. This was Lessons from Ukraine for the Food and Global Security Network. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.